So, this week, David and Goliath, part 2. And as I said last week when we started this study, we're coming at it a little bit differently than most lessons tend to go on this. We tend to take the story very straightforwardly, which is great, but a lot of times it can fall into the trap of being just that familiar Sunday school story we're all used to hearing. And we've heard it so many times in our lives, and even if you've never set foot in church, it might be one of the couple stories, 2 or 3 stories you think about and just have heard culturally at some point. But as we started to see last week, I think when we pull these characters out from just being the Bible cardboard characters and give them kind of the allowances we would give ourselves and the understanding we want ourselves and look at them in a 3-dimensional way, we can learn quite a bit about them. And so we focused mainly on 4 people and groups being involved here. We have, of course, Saul in the story. And then we've got Goliath, locking him in with all the Philistines. We've got David. And we've got Eliab, or Eliab, whichever one we're going to call him. I think we'll call him Eliab because I'm going to end up saying that one anyways. So we've got Saul, Goliath, David, and Eliab here. And as we saw in 1 Samuel chapter 17, where the story's at the beginning of the story, the Philistines and the Israelites are once again preparing to duke it out, which they've been doing all throughout the book of Judges and all throughout the preceding chapters here in 1 Samuel, with varying degrees of success on either side, right? So the Philistines will get great victories and subjugate the Israelites for a while. The Israelites would find a judge, and they would overtake the Philistines again with God's help and power and repenting and relying on him and trusting in him. And in chapter 17, they come together again at this valley, and it's almost like the Philistines, in recognition of this pattern, are like, all right, this time we're just going to haul off. We're tired of this. It's like we want to fight, and we have all the reasons for fighting, but we're tired of everybody going out there and, most of us dying. So we're going to pick one guy who happens, in this case, to be a particularly huge guy. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 4, and there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. So last week we mentioned that there's all kinds of numbers on what these things add up to, just all kinds of numbers. But it tends to hover around Goliath's suit of armor being 125 pounds or so, and this iron tip of his spear being about 15 pounds. As Mr. Webb said last week, it's like carrying a bowling ball on a stick into battle. And Goliath himself being over 9 feet, which goes all the way from 11 feet to 6 feet, but you end up, most people thinking, clocking in at probably 9'9". And when the average size of someone is most likely around 5.5, you're adding considerable elements of danger here for them. So they come together this battle. They send out the champion, or the man in the middle, kind of the idea, the one who's going to take it on himself, take the fight on himself and represent him. So Goliath comes out, and he comes out with this armor bearer, and he calls out to the Israelites. In verse 8 of 1 Samuel chapter 17, am not I a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. And the deal is that if they're able to kill Goliath, the Philistines will serve the Israelites. But if Goliath wins, then the Israelites serve the Philistines again. And as we saw in verse 11, When King Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So we backtracked after that, and we started talking about some history, specifically last week, of these two sides. So as just a quick minute on refreshing, you have the Philistines kind of coming into their own here in the 12th and 13th centuries. Very much a war-making, very powerful people. But as people who would study their opponents as they go to fight and go into battle, they've also got a really good memory. They know their history. Several times, as we looked at in the book of 1 Samuel, you have the Philistines themselves saying, before they deal with Israel, well, isn't this the God that did all those things to the Egyptians? And shouldn't we, be careful here? Which is why at one point in one battle, they get scared before going into the battle with the Israelites. But at that point, Israel wasn't obeying God, and so he let the Philistines win, and they captured the ark, which was a victory for the Philistines, but then led to a world of hurt for the Philistines. That for them would still be a fairly recent memory. And one of the places that experienced these severe hemorrhoids or whatever they were, again, all over the place on interpretation. One of the cities that experienced them was one of the Philistines' main city of Gath, Goliath's hometown. So this is also something in his head. So they come to this fight with memories, painful memories, but also, as we said last week, they got some confidence. In their God still, but especially in Goliath. And when Goliath comes out, he's very dismissive of the Israelites as being servants of Saul. Now, when we talked about Saul, we went all the way back to his beginning, when he's found in 1 Samuel, I think, chapter 9, going on a search for his father's missing donkeys. And his father kind of comes from let's put it up here, he's got some well-to-do family background. Saul is initially, in his first few encounters, kind of shy and reserved. But he's also, let's see, even from the very first story we see him in, Saul's concerned about presentation. Because when the one traveling with him says, hey, shouldn't we go see Samuel, see the man of God, about these missing donkeys, the first thing that pops up in Saul's head is, well, we don't have a gift to bring the man of God. Kind of just like it's, a trick the man of God has to do, and you have to reward him for seeking his help and helping you. But his first concern is kind of about the presentation of the matter and not being adequate enough to come before Samuel. And so he goes and he sees Samuel, and Samuel is told that this good-looking guy, this tall guy, handsome guy, is to be Israel's king. So they've rejected God. They want a king for themselves so they can be like everybody else. And so God tells them, tells Samuel, this is going to be it. And when Samuel tells this to Saul, and even gives Saul signs to confirm it, 3 different signs to confirm that this is God's will, Saul is still not especially trusting. And we talked as well that when it's time to publicly select the king, and the families are narrowed down and the people are supposed to be chosen from them, that it's also not the best of circumstances for Saul to want to stand up and wave his hand and say, yep, I'm your king. because before Samuel reveals who it is, he again rebukes them for wanting a king in the first place. So pretty much any time that the kingdom is mentioned and Saul is introduced to anybody, it's prefaced with, by the way, you disobeyed God and you've done a horrible thing and you've made a massive mistake, and here's your mistake. Here's your king. So, yay, good for you. So if you're Saul, you can see why, in addition to being shy and having all the problems he's got, that he would be over in a corner somewhere, kind of hiding out and not particularly wanting the attention to be drawn to himself. But God blesses this king, gives them a great military victory, including a first military victory that ties in with his history of being from Benjamin, a tribe that was nearly completely wiped out. And just as much as it's in the Philistines' memory that they've had all this recent trouble over the past couple hundred years with the Israelites, I come at this as thinking that this is something that the sin of Benjamin and Benjamin nearly being wiped out entirely and only surviving by others being killed and their wives taken, or going out in 7 brides for 7 brothers thing and capturing women and bringing them back, that's still in the minds of people in Benjamin and in the minds of people in Israel. So when Saul comes to his story with all these inadequacies we see, I tend to think it's got some historical context for that. Like, there's no wonder that he would come in feeling not up to the task or not worthy of the task or not prepared for it, because Benjamin really is the least of anything in Israel. But they launched this rescue mission for Jabesh Gilead, which Saul is very passionate about, possibly because that's where his, great-great-grandmother comes from in that whole incident. But it's where they took their wives from so Benjamin could survive in the town of Jabesh Gilead. So Saul comes to it with a great passion. They're able to save Jabesh Gilead. Samuel celebrates this great military victory. And Saul is actually given credit to God here. And Samuel again gathers the people together in chapter 12 of 1 Samuel. And even as they're celebrating this victory, let's look at verse 16. Now therefore stand and see this great thing which the Lord will do before your eyes. Is it not wheat harvest today? I will call unto the Lord, and he shall send thunder and rain, and ye may perceive and see that your wickedness is great, which ye have done in the sight of the Lord, in asking you a king. So Samuel called unto the Lord, and the Lord sent thunder and rain that day, and all the people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel. And all the people said unto Samuel, Pray for thy servants unto the Lord thy God, that we die not, for we have added unto all our sins this evil to ask us a king. So again, remember, this is your big celebration for being king and for celebrating these great victories. And you're just now being again thunderously, literally, publicly rebuked. In verse 20, and Samuel said unto the people, Fear not, for ye have done all this wickedness, yet turn not aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. He encourages them not to go after vain things and wicked things, reminds them that he'll pray for them and be their support still. In verse 24, only fear the Lord and serve him in truth with all your heart, for consider how great things he hath done for you. But if ye shall still do wickedly, ye shall be consumed, both ye and your king. So all over these first chapters of Saul's existence in the Bible, I don't know, I get the impression that there's just very much already a short lease in place. And so when Saul is pulled so quickly in these chapters later on for the way his heart is, for what he does, it's not especially shocking, I don't think, because we've been led into with so much of this. And so as we wrapped up last week, in the very next chapter, in chapter 13, Saul has this first instance of disobedience, of massive disobedience, where he offers up this burnt offering before Samuel shows up in verse 9 of chapter 13. And Saul said, Bring hither burnt offerings to me and peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. And it came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him, that he might salute him. And Samuel said, What hast thou done? And Saul said, Because I saw that the people were scattered from me, and thou camest not within the days appointed, that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash. Therefore said I, The Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself, therefore, and offered a burnt offering. And to me here, this inadequacy idea screams through again with Saul, because he instantly, as he does throughout all these chapters, goes in the deer in the headlights mode. And he comes up with every excuse to make himself look better, to try to justify himself, to try to explain it away. Puts it on the people, which he's also prone to do. I saw the people were scattered from me. Puts it on Samuel, you didn't show up when you were supposed to. And then blames the outside situation as well, the Philistines gathering themselves together. In verse 13, Samuel said to Saul, "Thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. For now will the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever." And here we get our first David mention. "But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart. And the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee." So we get our first item to fill in here. Man after God's own heart. Because all this doubt, all this fear, all this disobedience, everything is running through Saul's heart. It's just this internal thing that he can't seem to shake, even when he's got the Spirit of God upon him. And at the end of chapter 13, Samuel rises, goes on with his thing, and let's see. Oh, nope, it's not there. Lost track of it. Oh, okay, chapter 14. So we end up with one more clash with Saul and the Philistines, where Saul, who I think at this point is already been publicly smacked by Samuel here, because there's no way people around them aren't seeing this, is publicly told, "You won't execute your own son, Jonathan," after a whole mess of things happens. But in verse 47 of chapter 14, and I guess this is where we actually ended last week, we're given still this idea, even with the disobedience and God saying you're not going to, your kingdom will not continue, God still does in verse 47 give him some blessing here. So Saul took the kingdom over Israel and fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, and against the children of Ammon, and against Edom, and against the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines, and whithersoever he turned himself, he vexed them. So Saul has got some of the hero here. They wanted a king to defend them from their enemies, to be like other nations, but to protect them, to have a visual representation to protect them. And that's exactly right now what God's allowing them to have. So they're consolidating this kingdom. Saul's taking on and defeating all these enemies. And you can see, even just in those few verses there, why David mourned Saul, part of why David mourned Saul so much later on. Because for Israel, this is, with all his flaws, a national hero. And someone who's given them some prestige here. But in chapter 15, as we continue the story this week, because of what the Amalekites did hundreds of years before to the people of Israel, kind of sneak attacking them, God had promised that it would catch up to them one day. And in chapter 15, here's where it's supposed to catch up. Verse 1. Samuel also said unto Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint thee to be king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore hearken thou unto the voice of the words of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not. But slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass." And Saul gathered the people together and numbered them in Salem, 200,000 footmen and 10,000 men of Judah. So he's got quite a few. And I think it's relevant for the Goliath story. At the end of chapter 14, we can tack on verse 52 to all this. 1 Samuel 14:52, "And there was sore war against the Philistines all the day of Saul. And when Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he took him unto him." So this army that fears, that's worried when Goliath shows up, these are the most valiant people that Saul can find in Israel. These are the best of the best, because whenever Saul sees them, he grabs them and keeps them for himself. And that's something that no doubt continued in his process as he went along in building his army. So Saul is told to get rid of the Amalekites. and to completely wipe them out because of what they did to Israel. And in verse 7 of chapter 15, and Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah until it cometh to shore, that is over against Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, and of the oxen, of the fatlings, and of the lambs, and all that was good. It would not utterly destroy them, but everything that was vile and refuse, that they destroyed utterly.
Like wives and children.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
Nothing important.
Right. So they get rid of, they made sure they kept the sheep, though. Sheep were very important here. So they got rid of what they deemed vile and refuse, kept the king alive, kept the best. And as we're going to find out later on, Saul has even set up a monument to himself for this victory. But in verse 10, then came the word of the Lord unto Samuel, saying, It repenteth me that I have set up Saul to be king, for he has turned away from following me, and hath not performed my commandments. And this is interesting. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried unto the Lord all night. So even after Saul's previous disobedience, Samuel is still interceding for Saul, still praying, either for Saul's heart to change, or for forgiveness, or for strength for whatever comes next, or just mourning again the downfall of this person who had done great things with God's power. Verse 12, and when Samuel rose early to meet Saul in the morning, it was told Samuel, saying, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set him up a place, and has gone about and passed on and gone down to Gilgal. So he has set himself up, kind of a memorial. Verse 13, and Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, Blessed be thou of the Lord, I have performed the commandment of the Lord. And I just have to wonder if Saul did think he did it, if he was convinced. Like maybe he was half listening when Samuel told him what he was actually supposed to do, or whatever was happening. But I think this is sincere on Saul's part. Verse 14, and Samuel said, What meaneth then this bleating of the sheep in mine ears, and the lowing of the oxen which I hear? And Saul said, They have brought them from the Amalekites. Notice the first words he uses. They. They have brought them from the Amalekites. Oh, you don't like this? Oh, this isn't like, oh, they have brought them. Same thing he does repeatedly. For the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice unto the Lord thy God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed. And it's quite possible he's telling the truth. Like maybe the people did spare the best. But then Saul just went along with it when he was supposed to be as their king, telling them to keep God's commandments still. Then Samuel said unto Saul, Stay, and I will tell thee what the Lord hath said to me this night. And he said unto him, Say on. And Samuel said, When thou wast little in thine own sight, and I think the ESV and others kind of update that to present tense, though you're little in your sight, which is also interesting to me. I haven't actually looked into the tenses there, but I kind of wonder if that's pretty loaded. Wast thou not made the head of the tribes of Israel, and the Lord anointed thee king over Israel? And the Lord sent thee on a journey and said, Go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they be consumed. Wherefore then didst thou not obey the voice of the Lord, but didst fly upon the spoil, and didst evil in the sight of the Lord? And Saul said unto Samuel, Yea, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, and have gone the way which the Lord sent me, and have brought Agag the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But again, the people took of the spoil, sheep and oxen, and all these things to sacrifice to the Lord. Right now it's got an added dimension to it, which again, possibly true. Maybe that was the reason they gave themselves for sparing them. But said, we're going to save these things, and we're going to sacrifice to them. And Samuel again points out in probably one of those famous verses about God having more delight in obedience than even in this sacrificial system that he set up for them to carry out and to do. And that rebellion is one of the things that he just hates the most. In verse 24, and Saul said unto Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord in thy words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Now therefore I pray thee, pardon my sin, and turn again with me that I may worship the Lord. And this is the time when Samuel says, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going back with you. I'm not worshiping. I'm not participating in this farce now, is what it is. Because, he tells him in verse 26, thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord hath rejected thee from being king over Israel. And as Samuel turned about to go away, he laid hold upon the skirt of his mantle, and it rent. And I was reading some commentators talking about that being actually like the hem of the robe he was wearing. And one in particular I thought was interesting, saying that this robe that Samuel would have had on, as opposed to kind of mantle here, this robe that Samuel would have had on would have been pretty closely fitting. So this is not just him grabbing for something and Samuel turns and just rips. This has possibly got an idea of violence to it. Like he's grabbing a hold of Samuel and using some force here. In verse 28, and Samuel said to him, the Lord hath rent the kingdom of Israel from thee this day, and hath given it to a neighbor of thine that is better than thou. And that's the thing, like once again, slapped in the face. Like God's going to give it to someone who's a man after his own heart. And also, this guy's better than you. And this neighbor that's going to get it is better than you've been. And that this has made God sad. In verse 30, Saul admits he sinned, but doesn't take it any further than that. And it's great contrast to David's brokenness over his sin later on. But Saul is just kind of, again, like whatever will make the situation better for him. I've sinned, yet honor me now, I pray thee, before the elders of my people and before Israel, and turn again with me that I may worship the Lord thy God. So, politician here, public perception points. Come back with me. Let the people see that we're okay, that everything's good, that there isn't any problem here. And then Samuel chops the king to pieces, the king of the Amalekites to pieces, like you do, and sends this great message, which in a way is a funny story with the way Agag acts around Samuel, having heard apparently nothing ever about Samuel. Agag just like kind of wanders in thinking, hey man, everything's cool, everything's good, and he just immediately hacked to pieces. And in verse 34, then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his house to Gibeah of Saul. And Samuel came no more to see Saul until the day of his death. Nevertheless, Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord repented that he had made Saul king over Israel. And Saul mourned for Saul too. So, as we look at this story, and for all intents and purposes, Saul's going to continue reigning for many years, but for all intents and purposes, this is it. Like he's done, Samuel's done with him. And it's basically like he had abdicated the throne that day, really. Anything else we want to add to the Saul list before we continue?
He's done. Before he even gets to Goliath, David and Goliath, he's done.
Yeah. So as we wander into the David and Goliath story, yeah, this is a guy that he's burned his chances. He's gone. Anything else?
Yeah, it adds a new dimension to the whole story of not killing anybody. I mean, of letting the people do what they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about them already having stood up and said, no, we're not going to let you kill Jonathan.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's like, well, they're not going to listen to me, so I'm not going to try.
Yeah.
And then God says, nope, that doesn't count.
Right. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's kind of a good word of warning for us. If God says do something and we're like, yeah, but they wouldn't let me do it.
Yeah. When we've got a clear idea from God of what we're supposed to be doing, or a clear command, yeah, God doesn't let the crowd around us be the excuse for not doing it. Yeah.
Well, no, I don't know.
Go with it, Derek.
I'm just wondering, like, I guess I was thinking,
Let's say something controversial. Come on.
like, should Saul have just been like, no, thank you, when, he was anointed to be king or made to be king? Would that have been the right thing to do, or should he have just, I don't know,
Should have
been
obeyed.
God
better?
didn't invite
Should
him
have
to
just
be
obeyed.
king. God
Just
didn't
obeyed.
invite him to be king.
King.
God said you are the king.
Right, yeah. So that's something, it's not that, but it's, yeah, he should have.
And he liked being king. I mean, he liked being a hero and stuff.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's just obedience was his problem. Incomplete obedience, mostly.
Yeah.
Not absolute, usually. Just
Yeah.
incomplete.
Yeah.
I should put that up here too. Yeah, I mean, he did some stuff he was supposed to do.
It might be getting
Well, he
too-
was
too low
really a
for
better
listen.
king than most of the kings that they had.
Yeah.
He was actually a pretty decent king, but because he was supposed to be the beginning of a line, the man of covenant, and I think that shows us that God holds those who are in covenant with him, like us, to a higher level than just normal obedience. He holds pastors to a higher level of degree of responsibility. There's no, he expects certain things from those he puts in power and leadership, and especially those who are going to be bestowed upon some special responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and especially in this case, being the first, after Israel had been warned and told to stay on the right path, and their very first king can't hold it together.
Yeah.
So yeah, God's especially harsh with him. So yeah, so when we come into the story of David and Goliath and this whole showdown, Saul's just got a whole lot of stuff going on. And one thing I just hadn't really thought about until we started looking at it last week was that just politics back then weren't the same as it does now, and especially even more so has stuff just passed by word of mouth. So there's no way, just Israel just doesn't know about this stuff, about what's going on, about what Samuel's done, about Samuel being done with him, about Saul being rejected, and just all these different things. So this army here that's terrified in chapter 17, when they're referred to as servants of Saul, well, what does that mean? That carries with it a whole lot of things. So the guy they're supposed to be servants of and following isn't in the best shape, and it gets even worse in chapter 16. So one more chapter before we get to the actual story. In verse 1 of chapter 16, and the Lord said to Samuel, how long wilt thou mourn for Saul? Which Samuel continues getting sad about this. Seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel, fill thine horn with oil and go. I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons. And this gives you an idea of how much things have already changed. In verse 2, and Samuel said, how can I go? If Saul hear it, he will kill me. And the Lord said, take an heifer with thee and say, I am come to sacrifice to the Lord. So it tells us something about where Saul's at already by this point. So not only just because God's not working with Saul anymore, Samuel's staying away, but Saul's just a dangerous guy to Samuel right now.
Very much like Herod.
Very much like Herod, yeah.
Very Herod.
Yeah. Perhaps you should go the other way around. Yeah. And it says something interesting to me about Samuel too, because throughout all these chapters, Samuel is just this big, bold guy that shows up, smacks everyone down, and goes back to his house. But I don't know. I like seeing this side of Samuel, the insecure, worried, scared side here. It again, makes him a real person. And God tells him, here's what you do it anyways. In verse 3, and call Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show thee what thou shalt do, and thou shalt anoint unto me him whom I name unto thee. And Samuel did that which the Lord spake, and came to Bethlehem, and the elders of the town, so not being like Agag, they know Samuel, trembled at his coming and said, comest thou peaceably? So it's just a moment of, hey buddy, what you doing? What you doing here especially? I come to destroy. Yeah. So you never know what's going to happen when Samuel shows up, particularly recently. And he tells them that he's come in peace, he's come to offer the sacrifice. And Jesse and his sons are called for this feast. In verse 6, and it came to pass when they were come that he looked on Eliab and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said unto Samuel, look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, but for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. So even after all that's happened with Saul, Samuel's still taken in by the appearances of a king, by someone who seems, pretty good in stature. So let's add this to the Eliab camp. Found to be good looking, maybe taller guy.
Strapping.
I like that. Yeah, strapping young fella. But God's not wasting any time here this time. He tells him, don't look on this because Eliab has some kind of spiritual heart issue going on. So we're not judging books by covers anymore like we did with Saul. We're going all the way in, and there's something that's not right that's there. In verse 8, then Jesse called Abinadab, and made him pass before Samuel, and he said, neither hath the Lord chosen this. Continues all this way through 7 sons until verse 11. And Samuel said unto Jesse, are here all thy children? And he said, there remaineth yet the youngest, and behold, he keepeth the sheep. And Samuel said unto Jesse, send and fetch him, for he will not sit down until he come hither. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, and withal of a beautiful countenance, and goodly to look to. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. All right, so David's also kind of the strapping young fellow. He's got good looking. He's, reddish in a healthy way. Some healthy red joint here. So he's a healthy young fellow. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. And Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. Before we get to David and Goliath next week, the actual fight, we've got more than one person in the story that's been rejected. It's not necessarily clear that Samuel tells them for what he's been anointed, but just that he's been anointed. Maybe they thought it was to follow Samuel, to be the next maybe prophet or judge or whatever, but he's been anointed. And all these other brothers specifically have not, starting with the oldest one. Verse 14, but the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. And Saul's servants said unto him, behold, now an evil spirit from God troubleth thee. Let our Lord now command thy servants, which are before thee, to seek out a man who is a cunning player on a harp. And it shall come to pass, when the evil spirit from God is upon thee, that he shall play with his hand, and thou shalt be well. And Saul said to his servants, provide me now a man that can play well, and bring him to me. Then answered one of the servants and said, behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, that is cunning in playing, and a mighty valiant man, and a man of war, and prudent in matters, and a comely person, and the Lord is with him. All right. So what else can we add?
That whole list.
Yeah, that whole list. So let's say.
And he's a man, not a boy.
Young man, yeah, but still a man, yeah. He's not a little 8-year-old boy, as like his picture. Man of war, been to war.
Yeah, so he's done something.
About 8 years old. Man of war. Yeah. Which is critical in this story.
I saw a colored paper that would disagree.
And many flannel graphs.
Regular Baptist press needs a conversation.
I mean, just a man of war doesn't necessarily mean he was could have been an armor bearer, could have been a lot of, but he's been in battle, so he's battle hardened in some way.
He's done somewhat.
So it doesn't be like a 25-year-old or something, but
Yeah.
he could certainly be 16 or 15 or something.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a sneak preview here into chapter 17 further by going to, what was it? Verse 33. 1 Samuel chapter 17. And Saul said to David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. And David said unto Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock, and I went after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. David said, moreover, the Lord that hath delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, go, and the Lord be with you. Right, all right, that's pretty impressive. Have at it. All right, so David, so either, he's battle hard in some way. These stories possibly have gotten around about him tracking down these things and killing them, which is impressive. And we've got, like we had some confidence over here, we've got a different sort of confidence here. So immediately from moment one, there's a contrast in the two. Despite Saul being given 3 signs, including a wild, crazy night of prophesying, like whatever was happening there, Saul has just no confidence whatsoever. It seems like in himself, but just in God's word. But David has all this experience, all this confidence already built up inside from all these things that have happened and from his heart as well. And so back here in verse 16, this is the kind of guy they're going to get. And verse 19, wherefore Saul sent messengers unto Jesse and said, send me David thy son, which is with the sheep. And you have to wonder if maybe they thought this is part of what the whole anointing thing was about. He's been picked for something. And Jesse took an ass laden with bread and a bottle of wine and a kid, and sent them by David his son unto Saul. And David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. So there he is as the armor bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, let David, I pray thee, stand before me, for he hath found favor in my sight. And it came to pass, when the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, that David took an harp and played well with his hands. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. And at this point, no spear throwing in David's direction is going on. David's just playing. Saul's being relieved. And so even with all that's happened, we'll put way down on the bottom of this list where it's unseeable on camera. There's still some mercy from God happening in his life. There's still some relief here. And in this case, it's brought on by this guy that's brought before him, who little known to him is going to be his replacement soon enough. All right, so I think we're pretty much through our overview of the entire situation, and we'll wander into this story next week. And I think it's interesting to me at least to look at all the background and exactly just what's happening in everybody's heads, including Israel, with this king who is disobeyed, been rejected, but now is also, again, word of mouth, known to be kind of nuts at this point. So, and going through some mental health issues. So Israel is going to fight in chapter 17 under the banner of a king who's not all there. And I have no doubt that they know that in this chapter. And we'll see what happens. So any other things to add? Further thoughts?
I just think the humility that's shown, or at least the obedience that David shows by still being with the sheep
Mm-hmm.
when he clearly has many skills.
Yeah.
And he's not just like, he's not raring to break the traces and run off and make his mark on the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's just the guy who's doing the job right in front of him.
Doing what his father told him to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Unlike a certain shepherd I know.
A certain terrible, terrible shepherd. Yeah. Yeah, so David is a couple of times here in a row going to be found just with the sheep, just doing his thing. After this grand anointing, after serving with the king. So however long of time or short of time may have taken place between chapter 16 and 17, yeah. Now he's been before the king and he's the king's armor bearer, and in chapter 17 he's still just doing what his dad tells him to do. So, which is impressive with him.
The lions that he strikes down, we learned from a nature show that the kind of lions that they encountered in Israel were Asiatic lions and not African lions. And if you look at them, they look like villain lions. They're scruffier and kind of ugly. They look like pests. I thought that was cool. Because I was had a picture of him fighting like Mufasa, and it's not Mufasa.
Yeah.
It's more like Scar.
Okay, that's good. I like that. Yeah. Like old Tarzan kind of showdown style with an African lion. Yeah, that's interesting. Scar over Mufasa. I like that. It's a good way to think of it.
But the bear was Baloo.
The bear was Baloo. You can't beat up Baloo though. It's so sad. It's so sad.
He was just so annoyed by his laissez-faire attitude. Die, bear.
It's a tragic story of hunting down a singing bear and killing it. Bound to happen sooner or later. The singing bear just wants to eat. So, all right, and I think we're all set to get into it next week here.